Just a heads up that we will be recording this session, so don't feel like you have to rush and take notes. So thank you for joining us for our May webinar, Exploring Human Impacts and Solutions. I think this is one of the really powerful and amazing things about teaching with birds is they provide a really useful window into our impact on the world. So Susan and I are from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds. My name is Kelly Schaefer, and I am our our outreach coordinator for the K-12 education team. And I'm joined by Susan, who will be in the chat window to share links with you and answer your questions. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. And here at the K-12 education program, our mission is to create innovative resources that really help kids connect to their local habitats by experiencing the science process in fundamental hands-on ways and helping to build a connection to their natural world. And we achieve that in a few different ways. So we kind of view our work as touching on these three pillars: nature connection, citizen science, and ultimately inquiry investigations. We have a two-pronged approach to meeting those pillars by providing trainings like this one, and hopefully again someday soon in person, and by creating resources for educators to use that will help those kids achieve those three pillars. And we have a really meaty topic to talk about today and a lot of great resources that I want to share with you. So my goal for today is to go over some research about human impacts on our environment and highlight one of our free lessons for you all, and talk a little bit about Ebird and some of the suite of resources that are available to you through our websites that can help you do really cool data explorations with your students. So let's jump right into this topic of human impacts and birds. So I'm curious, what are some things that you think about when you hear the idea of human impacts? What are some ways that you think humans affect bird populations? Let's start with that first question. You can go ahead and share your ideas in the chat window. I realize that for this webinar, I kind of assumed that everyone's familiar with Zoom, but in case you're not, you'll find the chat window by looking for the little speech bubble icon. Feel free to click on that. Please make sure that you're sending to all panelists and attendees. All right, I see some ideas starting to roll in. Habitat loss, window strikes, climate change, pollution, sure, absolutely. Disrupting migration patterns. Yeah, we can think about lights in cities, for example, drawing in birds while they're migrating. Pollution and pesticides, litter, sure. Invasive species, cats, that's a big one. And I like that Francisco saying, we just change the environment. Yeah, we do. I mean, we, as well as birds, need resources to survive. When we extract those resources, we have an impact, whether for good or ill. Here are some great ones. People are also pointing out some other ways that we might impact birds that are kind of more positive, by having bird feeding stations, providing bird baths and water for birds, providing nesting location. Yeah. Absolutely. And then some other things coming up are creating issues with non-native species, and hunting. So yeah, these are all ways that people can have impacts on birds. Now here's more kind of a value question. And I think this one is a little more difficult to answer. Do you think human impacts have been overall good, bad, neutral? And why would you say that? Brianne saying it's complicated. Sure. Some folks are saying overall bad, that there's been a lot of deforestation. It can be really hard to quantify, right? We've done a lot of good things for birds. We have some, depends on the species. I think you might be getting at it there. Yeah. Some things could benefit one species or kill or hurt another. Absolutely. That's very, very true. And sometimes it's really hard for us as folks trying to do our best to help the environment to know what the impacts are going to be, because these systems are so complicated. Bad, because the numbers are plummeting. Bad, but we can get things better. I like that thought. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and validate those of you who said bad, but some of you might be familiar with this study. We have lost 2.9 billion birds since 1970. So just in 50 years, looking at the total number of birds in Canada and the United States, we've seen a decrease of 2.9 billion across species. This paper came out over a year ago now, in September and fall, and it was picked up by a lot of major news outlets that there's a crisis for birds. And actually that was kind of heartening to me to see that it was picked up by a lot of major news outlets, because it was a signal to me that this is something that people care about, this idea that we've lost 2.9 billion birds in a human lifespan. And Susan just shared a link to the website about this paper. So that's kind of hard to quantify. When you get to numbers that big, it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around. So how this breaks down is that we're looking about 1 in 4 birds gone since 1970. So that puts it in context of how many there were and how many there are now. And the reason that this causes some concern for us is because we're seeing that we are seeing declines across almost all habitat types. Certainly there are some, like grassland birds and shorebirds, that are having a harder time, but these are widespread declines. So it's a signal to us that it's not just like one habitat suffering, but that there is kind of a bigger thing going on. Something is happening in which our environments are losing the ability to support the amount of life that they did previously. And this can be kind of devastating. And for our students, this is really scary to hear, right? This is one of those doom and gloom things that makes you worried. Especially when we're seeing similar declines in total insect species, which makes sense, right? Because a lot of bird species rely on insects. If we're seeing decline in insects, we're going to probably see decline in our birds as well. But there is good news. So we're seeing these declines in groups of birds overall, but when we zoom in and look at certain groups, we're actually seeing increases in that time period. We've seen an increase in raptors, an increase in waterfowl, and an increase in woodpeckers. And the thing that these groups all have in common is that we made concerted conservation efforts to help them out. So for raptors, they were really affected by DDT and eggshell thinning, and we banned DDT. We helped these species recover. We did some reintroductions with things like peregrine falcons, and now we are up by 15 million. Waterfowl, kind of, the history of conservation in the United States is that it was actually hunters who helped really get this conservation movement going because they saw declines in the birds that they enjoyed harvesting and wanted to make sure that they were around forever. So there's actually a really strong history in waterfowl management, and we're pretty good at it. We've got an increase of 35 million. Similarly, we've been managing forests better, and we have an increase in woodpeckers. So there is absolutely reason to hope when we set our mind to it, when we set our money and our effort and our brains to it, we can help these birds. And so that to me is why this study is a really good thing. It is good because it lets us know that there is a broad scale problem and provides us with the opportunity to act. One of those things that we can do and encourage our students to do is participate in the 7 simple actions to help birds. You'll see things on here like make windows safer, keep your pet cats indoors, use native plants, reduce plastic use. So there are some things in here that you might be able to tackle with your students on your school grounds. You could possibly do a survey of the windows around your school and see if you notice window strikes and then try to mitigate those. You could, if you have the ability, plant some native plants or do some plastic reduction efforts. So there are things that we can do, that these actions that add up and make a difference. One of them that I want to highlight for you was the 7th action, doing citizen science. So watching birds and sharing what you see. This is one of the 7 simple actions, and it is a really powerful one. So let's take a moment to pause and make sure that we have a shared idea of what citizen science is. So in the chat window, please feel free to share some thoughts that come to mind when you hear the term citizen science, maybe some keywords, a definition, or some projects that you're aware of. Any thoughts? Cheryl saying collecting data for projects like Project Feeder Watch and Journey North. Absolutely. Encouraging the public to take part in a collection of observations/data. Absolutely. Collecting large data sets through apps used by everyday people, BioBlitzes, people allowing researchers to use their hibernating feeders to process data. That's one I wasn't familiar with. That's super cool. Citizen science or community science is everyday people helping scientists gather information they need to answer their research questions and influence policymakers. I love it. You guys really know this definition. As Vanessa points out, citizen science can also be called community science so that everyone feels welcome. Yes, so you guys have really hit the nail on the head. It's all about regular folks participating in projects, making observations, recording what they see, and sending that data to professional scientists. What's incredible about citizen science is this gives scientists a tool that we've really never had before, which is these amazing, huge data sets across time and space. And what's cool about that 3 billion birds research is that one of the data sets, one of the primary data sets that they used was the Christmas bird count, which is a citizen science project, one of, if not the longest running citizen science projects in the United States. So citizen science data is what put out this warning for us, and it's going to be what helps us see if we're reversing those trends in the future, because it builds these incredibly large data sets that the scientists can then use to take conservation access and, as somebody said, providing the information necessary to influence policy. Citizen science is a really powerful tool because it is so adaptable and diverse. So even if you don't end up pursuing citizen science related to birds, I hope you will consider pursuing it with your students on another subject. There are many out there. So it is something that can be local or global. It can be all in line or outside. It can be from the scale of galaxies to the scale of microbiomes. We really do view these as projects where volunteers and folks who aren't professional scientists help scientists answer real world questions. And we think of this as a partnership, right? So this is something that we all get something out of. Us as participants and our students as participants know that our data is important. We know that we're helping understand our world better. And with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology citizen science projects, we actually have access to these same data sets that scientists are using. There are citizen science projects of all types out there. If you want to check those out and find one that matches your interest or your students' interests, scistarter.org is going to be a great place to go. They have a project finder, so you can search by location or where you want to do the project, whether you want to be outdoors or indoors. And they even have an educator portal, so they'll help kind of curate projects that are appropriate for young people. All right, so now we know what citizen science is. We understand the impact that we're having on birds, at least in North America, and specifically Canada and the United States. Let's dive a little bit into how the citizen science data, and particularly the Ebird project, can help us explore these concepts further, and how Ebird, which is a citizen science project, is moving the needle on conservation science. So Ebird is the lab's largest citizen science project, and in fact, it is the largest biodiversity-related citizen science project in the world, with, I think we have by now hit our billionth observation, and I think we hit it on Global Big Day, which was in May. Well, it is May. It was May 8th. Which is really exciting. 1 billion observations is a really powerful data set. And this data is from all over the world. Every country in the world is represented, and it hits 98 to 99% of the bird species in the world. So it's a really powerful data set, and it is being used to publish new science. So Susan actually sent this link to me today, which was super cool. Just published was a new article, and the National Geographic has a write-up about this article, a scientific paper that looked at estimating the number of birds on Earth, and they came up with a kind of a large range, but 50 to 430 billion. And what I find particularly compelling about this research is that this paper used a combination of expert sources and Ebird data. So they had 3 expert sources and estimates that they used, and then they used Ebird data, which is, non-professional scientists have collected this data. Kids in classrooms have collected this data. I've collected it in my backyard. So the question is this data of the same quality? And the paper found that estimates created using Ebird were statistically comparable to those created using these expert sources, which tells us that the data is good quality data. So that's pretty exciting. Now, it also calculated species of birds and that have the highest population. Does anyone want to take a stab at what they think the most abundant bird in the world is? And make sure you're sending to all panelists and attendees. Some good guesses coming in there. We've got robins, song sparrows, rock pigeons, the red-billed, and I can never pronounce this right, qualia, perhaps, and house sparrows and starlings. So yes, number 1 is our friend, the qualia. Thank you, Leonora. Number 1 is our friend from the Home Depot parking lot, the house sparrow, with 1.6 billion. Coming in second place is the European starling with 1.3 billion. So good guesses all bound. Qualia. I'll keep practicing that. Oh, Lee. Yes. Okay. Apologies. Thank you, Lee. Awesome. So that's a cool paper. Here is another one that is a little bit more relevant to our conversation. Oops, these slides are a little out of order. Here we go. This was a study called Spatiotemporal Variation in Avian Migration Phenology. Citizen Science Reveals Effects of Climate Change. Now, this one is a lot more dense, and I'll be honest that I'm not entirely sure that I fully understood what I was reading. But what it comes down to is that this study was looking at spring arrival dates across species and locations and trying to see if there was any shift in avian migratory phenology. So the dates of arrival in bird species in response to climate change. What they found is that there's a lot of variation even across the same species, depending on what geographic location you were looking at. But they saw an average of about 0.8 days change, with some species in some locations changing by as much as 3 to 6 days. And I believe that those were species with the greatest changes tended to be those that had slow migrations. And there were a couple other categories as well. It comes down to there's different rates for different taxa and in different locations and different styles of migration. But we are definitely seeing a shift in migration timing relative to temperature, which we are using which was used in this study as an indication of climate change. The study did have some limitations because they were only able to study back to when Ebird started, which was, oh gosh, I should know the date, but is not as far back as you would need to go. Like ideally, you would be studying back to the 1970s, the 1940s, and but beyond if you could, but we didn't have a robust enough data set until that point. There are some limits to this study, but it is really interesting. And as we move forward in our understanding of climate change, as we continue to collect citizen science data, we'll get a more complete picture. But I also wanted to share this quote about the paper because I think it really highlights eBird's potential. While the eBird dataset we have employed has limitations, the sheer volume of observations, greater than 3 million in May 2011 alone, presents an unparalleled opportunity for examining spatio-temporal distributions of avian species in North America. Ebird also highlights the extraordinary potential for citizen science initiatives to generate novel data sets that can inform some of the most critical questions in ecology, conservation, biology, and global change arenas. Yeah, so I noticed that Lee brought up that there are some really critically endangered birds out there as well, and eBird does help us understand those birds and their plight. There was another paper that came out that I didn't highlight here some time ago that compared the effectiveness of geolocators, which are little chips that track location using daylight and other information, and they have to be put on birds. They're very expensive. Compared data gathered from those to data from eBird and their effectiveness in determining the range of endangered species, and found again that citizen science data was comparable to these really expensive and difficult methods of putting geolocators on birds, which is exciting because it also then makes this sort of study accessible and possible for communities without historically receiving a ton of funding for scientific research. They can start asking and answering their own questions with the same level of accuracy. All right, on we go. All of this to say that eBird is really powerful, and when you participate in eBird with your students, you are participating in a way that really matters. You're answering this essential question for your kids of why are we doing this? Because your data matters. It matters to conservation and it matters to understanding our world. If you are interested in learning more about eBird and how to participate, I'm not covering that in today's webinar, but we do have a free online course that would take you anywhere from about an hour and a half to 3 hours to complete, which is going to tell you everything you need to know to participate in eBird with confidence. So now I want to start diving into this free resource I mentioned. Recently, because eBird is just this incredible resource, we developed 4 curricula all across the grade bands that are all focused on eBird and meeting the NGSS standards for those grade bands. They are paid curricula. However, we have 1 lesson from each available to download for free. And I'm going to talk about the lesson or some of the resources in the 9 through 12 module, Monitoring Our Changing World, which focuses on human impacts as well as climate change. So in this curricula, we have chosen a format that is kind of pretty meaty. So they're divided into investigations, and there's a lesson and a lab for each investigation, and each one totaling about 90 minutes for the labs and 50 for the lessons. So the free lesson is the free investigation is investigation 1, which includes both the lesson and the lab. And it deals with this idea of habitat. We talked a little bit in the beginning about brainstorming ideas for how humans impact bird populations, and several folks brought up habitat destruction. And that is the leading, habitat loss is the driving factor in the rapid decline of most bird species. So this is kind of the leading factor in species decline. These photos here represent some of the 8 major biomes found in North America. And when we think about habitat and we think about land use, I think this is one of the really greatest challenges that exists to conservation. People need land and resources, and so do the animals that we share these habitats with. And how do we balance these needs? This map here is from the State of the Birds report from, I want to say, 2016. This is a map of the major biomes in North America. So just for a second, take a look at this map. See if you can locate what biome you are in, or at least dominant biome for your area. I'm in Ithaca, New York, so I'm in the light green, which is temperate forests. If you know your biome, you can understand a little bit more about how the birds in our area are doing. So this is from that same report, showing that 1/3 of all North American bird species need urgent conservation action, with 37% crossing the watch list threshold, which works out to about 432 species. And you can see how this varies by biome. For temperate forests, we have about 22% of species at risk. If you are in coastal habitat, you have 37% of species at risk. So the idea here is that students can kind of put their area and their location into context for how their local habitat is doing and how the bird species in their habitat are doing, excuse me. All right. So the lesson goes on to dive into some human impact stories, and we use some student readings on the passenger pigeon and the whooping crane as our kind of case studies. And so I'm going to tell you these stories just very briefly. And while I tell you them, as we kind of cover them in the writings for the students, I want you to think about what behaviors or aspects of each species biology led to their conflicts with humans. What steps were taken to preserve the species? Were they successful or not? So let's begin with the whooping crane. The whooping crane is an impressive 5-foot-tall bird that lived on prairies and marshlands throughout the United States. They were never super abundant. There was only about probably 2,000 of them because they, require large territories and specific habitats. In the early 1800s, the westward expansion in the United States meant that folks started converting prairies and wetlands to sources of food for themselves and their pasture animals. So that led to the destruction of a lot of habitat for the whooping crane. Whooping cranes are migratory species, so they breed in one area, winter in another, and they tend to winter on the coasts and breed in kind of the heartland area, but also up into Canada historically. Whooping cranes, because they were 5 feet tall and white, were really easy targets for hunters. So they were hunted pretty regularly, could be found in markets for food, and also their feathers. And one of the other aspects of their biology that put them at a disadvantage is that they are slow to reproduce. They lay 1 to 2 eggs per nest. Usually only one of those is going to survive. Sometimes, rarely, both survive. So you're looking at 1 to 2 young per nest or per year for these adults. So losing adults, they're not easily replaced. But they managed to survive despite let's see, it was 1941 when we were down to just 15 birds in the wild. Thankfully, their breeding grounds were in really, really remote northern Canada, so we just couldn't get to them, and they survived. By 1973, with the advent of the Endangered Species Act, a bunch of agencies, both in the United States and in Canada, banded together to try and save the species. And they began captive breeding programs where they took 1 of the 2 eggs from the nests that they finally found that breeding ground in wood buffalo in Canada, and then raised them in captivity using all sorts of different techniques. But they decided eventually to begin a reintroduction program and raised these young in costumes, because birds imprint. And so they raised them in whooping crane costumes so these whooping cranes could remain wild, and then taught whooping cranes part of their historical migratory pathway from Wisconsin to Florida by having them follow an ultralight aircraft. So a really complicated, expensive process, but people found these birds to be very charismatic. And now we are up to about 500, maybe close to 600 now in the wild, 800 total in the world. So still the rarest crane in the world, but doing much better. So that's our first case study, the whooping crane. Next up is the passenger pigeon. You might be familiar with stories about these birds. They were said to darken the sky when they migrated because their flocks were so numerous. They were once the most abundant bird species in North America, with populations of about 3 to 5 billion individuals. They were actually really dependent on these large flock sizes for migration, but also for breeding, because they bred in colonies and there's safety in numbers. They bred in eastern deciduous forests, and like the whooping crane, raised only 1 to 2 young per nest. But they often came into conflict with people because as human settlements grew, people needed wood for their homes, they needed pasture land, and so they began to clear these forests. Passenger pigeons, as you can imagine, flocks of billions that dark the sky for hours, could be really noisy and kind of gross. So they made a lot of noise, they pooped all over the place, they could devastate a harvest if a flock landed, and so they were aggressively hunted. People would stand out in the fields as a flock went over and just fire indiscriminately into these large flocks. By the late 1800s, it was becoming really hard to locate flocks of pigeons. And as I mentioned, they are colonial nesters and require large numbers of birds to breed successfully. So they just kind of started to dwindle. The ones that were left even really couldn't continue to breed super successfully. But as these birds became rarer, again, people tried to step in and begin a captive breeding program. But unfortunately, these efforts were never successful because of that flocking issue. The last pigeon, Martha, lived in captivity at a zoo and died in September of 1914. And with her death, the species was officially extinct. So we have 2 birds with fairly similar life histories, certain things in common, but very different outcomes in their stories. And I think these are really useful case studies for students to examine. Here are some of the discussion questions that we include with the readings that support these stories. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these things. What stuck out to you as being similarities or differences between the whooping crane stories? And what were some of the causes of their conflicts with people? One of the things that I think really sticks out to me about these stories is that idea of habitat and resources, right? We all need resources to survive. The people were trying to create agricultural fields and they were trying to feed themselves as they were learning to live in new habitats. And then we had these whooping cranes that, you know, evolved with indigenous populations that had a really different way of interacting with the environment. And so really weren't prepared for large scale conflict with European settlers. And we can see that they both also had challenges with replacing their depleted numbers because they were slow to breed. So we can see that humans played a role in their decline, but we can also see that efforts were made to save them because of differing biologies. However, there were different outcomes. So the passenger pigeons could not be successfully bred in captivity and therefore went extinct, whereas we found creative ways to raise whooping cranes in captivity and they were able to be saved from the brink of extinction. I would argue they're not safe now because there's only one wild remaining population and one reintroduced population. So they're vulnerable to natural disaster or disease, but we are much better off than we were previously. So that is the case studies that we use to kind of explore those ideas and concepts of conflict, habitat, and ways that humans can positively impact the story of endangered birds. Now I want to dive into some other resources not tied directly to this curricula that can be really useful to you as you explore birds in your area and start thinking about getting to know those species. So I'm going to switch screens here. I want to take us to Ebird. So let's start on the main page. So hopefully you're seeing the Ebird main page here. Up here you will see, ignore my stats, up here you will see the main tabs for Ebird. The two I want to draw your attention to are Explore and Science. So first I'm going to go to Explore. This is a really awesome information ecosystem. I love Ebird. You can learn so much just exploring here. You can find areas to bird around you by exploring regions or hotspots. If you want to see where a particular bird species is in your location, you can use species maps. You can also find out information about species using this explore species function. So I'm going to come down to species maps here. And I'm going to click on that. And that's going to open up this map for me where I can start looking up a bird species. Somebody in the chat window, what is your favorite local bird? And we'll look up that species. Western kingbird, let's do it. All right, so here's the Western kingbird, and the map automatically refocuses to the area where we have sightings for the species. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here, and you can get an idea of what's going on in this graph. You see areas that are gray, which mean we have data for these regions. Areas that are completely clear mean we don't have enough data for these regions. And then the darkness of the purple relates to the frequency that this bird is reported in these areas. So we can get an idea for the range of this species. You can zoom in to certain locations. So for example, let's do San Diego, California, and it will zoom in. Right now we have it set to year round, all years, but you could also just look at reports for the current year if you wanted. So let's set that date range. And then as you zoom in, the data becomes more refined and you can find these hotspots. So you could click on one of these hotspots. Red means seen in the last 30 days at that location. Blue means longer than 30 days since it's been reported there. And then you can click on the location, Doyle Community Park for this one, and then see all of the times that it's been seen. You can even click on that list and see all the other birds that were seen with it. And then say you want to be like, well, hey, I really don't know that much about Western kingbirds. Maybe I want to learn a little bit more. So I'm going to click on the Western kingbird name, and now it's going to take me to a species page for the Western kingbird. So I can see images, I can read about it a little bit. I can see how many times it's been reported by me and by everybody else in Ebird. And again, there's your range map. So Ebird has this really connected learning space for you. So not only can you figure out what birds are around you, you can also learn a little bit more about them and see images that have been shared with Ebird through and the Macaulay Library through people's checklists. So that's pretty cool. Let's go back to the main Explore page. And actually, no, you know what? For the sake of time, we're going to go to Science. This tab, I love this tab. There's so much cool stuff here. You can learn more about Ebird data and tools and how you want to access, how you can access Ebird data for your own data exploration. You can learn about how it's been used in conservation. I believe Susan's already shared that link a couple times, but here's where I want to take us. I want to take us to Ebird status and trends. This is your data submitted to Ebird, put into models. So we could search for a specific species here, or we could go to this explore all status and trends. This part is new. So if you've explored status and trends before, but not in the last couple months, this is new. They have now organized it all according to taxonomy. So you can scroll through and get a sense for how all of these birds are related, which I think is pretty cool. It's a really cool visual. But I'm going to go ahead and go back because I'm going to search for a specific species. I saw that somebody in the chat window had also suggested looking up a bluebird, so we'll do that. Bluebird. So you can see these amazing abundance animations. So these are estimates of relative abundance, looking at every single week of the year. And a relative abundance in this case means the estimated number of individuals detected by a birder traveling, I believe it's 1 kilometer, doing a 1 hour count at the optimal time of day. So we can see that the lighter color means less abundant, the darker means more abundant, and we can see how the abundance changes throughout the year. And you can even see areas where the birds are not common. There's the Mississippi, they don't hang out there as much. So that's pretty cool. This gets down to a really fine geographic range. And these models are created using citizen science data, land cover data, satellite imagery from NASA, all churned together in a supercomputer and extrapolate for areas that we don't have a lot of data from areas that we do have a lot of data for. Now, the next species I want to check out, let's see, I think we want to check out the chimney swift. So let's just see some of this really cool fine variation that you can start to see in these maps. So you have these animations, but you also have abundance maps, which are going to kind of break things down a little differently. So here we have just a general abundance map. You can see that this is kind of what you are used to seeing in a bird guide. It includes the breeding season and the migratory season. But if I want to look specifically at breeding, I can come over here to the column on the left hand and select that, which is what I'm going to do. And let's see if I can zoom in for you a little bit on this map, because I want to see if we can notice any patterns. So again, as with our other maps, the darker color means more abundant. Are you noticing any patterns in where we're seeing these darkest spots for the chimney swift? See kind of this blanket pink, and then there's some really darker concentrations. Vanessa's saying cities. Yes, absolutely. We're seeing some cities like here's Chicago. Is this Columbus or Cincinnati up here, or both? And even down in Texas, we're seeing some of our major city areas as well. So yeah, and that is really cool because we actually know this to be true about chimney swifts. Chimney swifts historically nested in hollowed out trees, but as people spread, we tend to not let deadwood stand, and so those trees started to become less abundant, and chimney swifts adapted to chimneys. So they are, Susan's saying it was Cleveland, definitely too many major sea cities in Ohio, absolutely. So we're actually being able to see some of the biology of these birds that we know already reflected in these models. So, and at really fine spatial scales too, which is pretty amazing. So that's some of the Ebird data that you can explore. You can get down to really fine grains. And so what I would challenge you to do, and I don't think we have time to do it here together, is I'd like to challenge you to look up a common species to your area, practice some of these tools, look at the maps and see if it matches your experiences observing the birds in your area. And also definitely it's fun to explore some kind of unusual birds or cool birds from around the world. So I challenge you to play with these and look at a species in your area. The next resource I want to share with you has to do with how we can have positive impact. So we've talked about habitat change, or excuse me, habitat loss being a major issue. We've also talked about birds having to adapt, like the chimney swift, to not having nesting locations. So chimney swifts were able to use chimneys, but there are other birds out there, particularly cavity nesters, who have a hard time finding spaces because we have, as I said, started removing deadwood. If those trees with cavities aren't allowed to stand, these birds have issues finding breeding locations, which means that their populations might be in decline. And this is an area where people can really have a positive impact by putting out nest boxes. nest boxes kind of replace those natural cavities. So I'm going to take us to Project Nest Watch, which is a citizen science project. If you work with students in spring or summer, I mean, nesting season can be challenging depending on what part of the country you're in, if it doesn't start early enough in spring. But I encourage you, this is amazing to do with students. You can build bird houses and really know that you're doing something for birds. And this Nest Watch has all of these amazing plans to help you build really good bird houses. So I went ahead and clicked on All About Bird Houses, and this will take you to an awesome resource page that will tell you all about the features of good bird houses and help you even pick out houses for birds in your area, which is the resource that I wanted to highlight for you tonight. So I recommend checking out the Right Bird, Right House Interactive. So it allows you to choose your location, and I'm in the Northeast, and then also choose your habitat area. So I'm mostly forest where I currently am. And then you click see results, and it's going to populate with birds that you can build either nesting platforms or bird houses for. And here's what I wanted to highlight for you. Species that are in decline have these little bars. So if you want to set out with the goal to help species in your area that are declining, here's one of the ways that you can do it. So you can scroll through these plans. You can see the level of difficulty for building. They also have kid-friendly markers if you're working with younger students. And you can choose to build a platform or a nesting box for birds that are declining in your area. I just hung out a house wren box a little late, but I just hung it out this weekend. So hopefully we'll see some action there. So as I mentioned, the Lab of Ornithology has just an incredible learning ecosystem out there for you. I hope that tonight's webinar highlighted some useful resources and will provide you with opportunities to explore human impacts and even potential solutions. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to my last slide here so that you can see our contact information. Definitely encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. We do provide completion letters, so you can email for one of those. And do want to note that this webinar will be posted on YouTube by Friday, I hope, and I will send an email out to everyone who registered with links and links to the recorded webinar and also the links to the resources that we discussed tonight. Any questions? Do you want to be respectful of your time? It is 7 p.m. So if you need to head out, thank you so much for joining us. Hi, Cheryl. Yes, we do give letters of completion. So it'll just be like a little letter talking about the webinar topic and that it was one contact hour. But if you could just email us with a request for that at k12lab@cornell.edu. All right, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope we'll see you at a future webinar. I'll be sticking around for a few more minutes in case you have questions, but I am going to mute myself for just a moment.